I want to welcome Laura Huang, and she is a management professor here at Wharton, and she's going to tell us about her new research, which has to do with investors using a gut feel to make decisions, important investment decisions. And I think it's based mostly on angel investors. And it's a little bit counterintuitive. It's not quite what you would think investors are relying on. So we're anxious to hear about that. So thank you for coming in.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I think that the best way to get into this is to ask you to do a short summary of the arc of the paper.
Sure. So what we found in this research was, well, actually, I'll step back a little bit. The origins of this paper was we were really interested in how investors make decisions. And this one thing kept coming up, right? So they would talk about the size of the market. They would talk about the product. But investors kept coming back to, well, then I rely on my gut feel, or then I invest based on my gut feel. I've even heard stories of investors kind of just saying, I invest because I rub my tummy, and that's how I make my investments.
Not what we would have expected.
Right. And so I thought that was really interesting, and I thought it was really kind of critical to understand what is this gut feel that they're referring to. And so the paper really sought out first. What we wanted to do was to do this investigation of what do investors actually mean when they say that they invest based on their gut feel. And what we found actually was really fascinating was that not only do they use their gut feel to make their investments, but that there's actually a practical reason, a reason for why they use their gut feel, and it makes sense in terms of looking at their outcomes and how effective they are. So one of the big findings of this paper in particular, and we're continuing on some follow-on work from here, but is that decisions are not all the same, right? We tend to think of decisions as being right or wrong, but in the entrepreneurial context, investors are very willing to be wrong. In fact, they know that they will be wrong on a lot of their investments. And so in terms of their gut feel, it doesn't actually make a difference in terms of being right or wrong on any one given investment decision that they're making. But it allows them to identify the home runs. When they rely on their gut feel, they may be wrong on a lot of different investments, but they're actually going to be able to be more likely to pinpoint that home run. So if we think about it in terms of baseball averages, right? So investors perhaps might have, if your goal is to have a very high batting average, your gut feel might not be as effective. But if you're willing to have a really low batting average but hit more home runs, then perhaps you want to rely on your gut feel.
So this is partly a strategy that works because of the level of investment, meaning it's like very, very early stage when a lot of things aren't proven and you can't marshal all the evidence you would like because this is just a new thing, let's say.
Exactly.
It might be the big new thing, but it probably isn't, but you're going to take a risk on it.
Right. So we were looking at the very earliest stages of ventures, right? So we're looking at angel investors who typically are the first outside external form of financing for these entrepreneurs. And you're at this stage where perhaps you may have a prototype, or maybe you just have a glimmer of an idea. You're not exactly sure what the market is going to look like. There may not even be a market out there. And so there's lots of hard data. There's numbers and facts and figures that you're able to put down. But a lot of those numbers are based on estimates and hopes and dreams and guesses. And so that hard data is actually not as reliable to these investors as their own experience, the things that they're getting from their own mental schemas and prototypes and mental models that they have really developed through lots and lots of investments. And that's kind of where their gut feel is coming from. And that becomes a more reliable factor to them in kind of gauging where this is going to be, in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years down the line.
So that's an interesting point. They're not just throwing darts at the dartboard. They're basing their decisions on a lot of experience. And so it's a sort of more of an educated guess, let's say.
Right. So we hear the term intuition and gut feel, and a lot of times we think about, this is something where it's going to be something that's very biased, or it's going to be something that is just based on some arbitrary kind of thing. But their gut feel is actually based on years of experience, investments that they've made that have gone well, that have gone poorly. So it's really something that is a criteria that they rely upon, and that, in fact, has a basis for this reliance.
So they're pretty good at this, or they wouldn't get to keep doing it.
It's funny. Some of them we've looked at. The investors that we looked at in one of our samples had all approximately around the same amount of experience. But we've also done studies where we looked at different levels of experience, right? Some that have maybe only been investors for 5 years, some that have been doing it for 35 years. And you do get lots of variance. For example, we had one investor who, he bought his house that he lives in now in Malibu off of one investment that he made. And he said, sometimes I can tell within 5 to 10 seconds of meeting somebody whether or not I'm going to invest in them, right? So there is a different – and there's others who do lots of due diligence, right? Due diligence probably for 3 months, 6 months, however long they do. And then they kind of say, well, throughout the course of that, it was this judgment that I had at the very end of it that I used my gut feeling to make this investment. So there's all sorts of ranges of this.
What are the key takeaways from your research, would you say?
I think one of the key takeaways is that this is a highly uncertain environment, right? There's extreme uncertainty in this environment. And so the ways in which we think about decisions are not going to be the same based on the different contexts, right? So in the entrepreneurial investment context, here you're looking at this portfolio strategy where we're not looking at was the decision a good one or not a good one. We're really looking at it in terms of I'm willing to have 9 really bad investments that I make and forsake that for one huge investment that turns into extremely profitable investment for myself, right? So there's this portfolio strategy. And so decision making is going to be different based on that. The other thing that I think was really an important takeaway from this is that there's different types of data out there. And the investor's gut feel is actually trumping the data behind business viability, right? So the hard data, so things around financials or market size or, product, that their gut feel was a more important consideration to them than some of these other things, right? And so that kind of matters. It's not to say that those things don't matter, but it's that there's lots of different considerations to consider, and we tend to have this very economic-driven model of how investors should make decisions when, in fact, perhaps we should consider these behavioral and micro-level influences.
At least at that early stage.
Yeah.
And also when you talk about they are maybe doing 10 investments and maybe one pays off, but in general they're doing small stakes, right? They're not betting the farm on each one of these. Is that correct?
Right. Relative to their net worth or to their wealth, these are small stakes, right? So it could be $20,000, $50,000 that they're investing, but we also are continuing to look at this in terms of follow-on investments. Do they continue to invest going forward? If you look at some of the venture capitalists, right, the Sequoias of the world, right, they're going to have a very different sort of criteria and different way of investing.
So if you hit on one Instagram, that's even if it was only a $20,000 investment, you're not doing too bad. Right?
Yeah, these extraordinarily profitable investments are returning things in spades. So,
were there conclusions here that surprised you?
We were a little bit surprised that gut feel had this kind of bifurcated result where it doesn't actually necessarily help you identify what's going to bring you a return or not a return, but that it does have this effect in terms of identifying those extraordinarily profitable investments. That was kind of surprising because it suggests that the way that we think about, we hear lots of this type 1, type 2 types of decision making, right? Do you rely on your intuition or do you rely on data? And it seems to suggest that there's room for both and that it's not quite that clear cut where intuition is necessarily this bad thing. It does also depend on your experience. It does depend on lots of other things.
So what are some practical implications? So if you're an investor, go with your gut, or don't ignore your gut entirely. How would you come away with some practical implications for investors?
One way that I've always thought was interesting to think about this is, I heard this quote at one point that was, some people go with their brain and some people go with their heart. And before you decide whether to go with your brain or your heart, you should decide whether you have a better heart or you have a better brain. Right. And so it's a little bit of that, right? You want to think about the criteria that you're using. You want to think about how you're making decisions. But if you're perhaps a very, very early investor in terms of maybe this is your first investment, you want to actually perhaps think about this and triangulate and look at all of the different pieces of data.
You don't know how good your gut
right,
is
exactly,
yet. Okay.
Exactly. So I think that goes into it.
Maybe this is an easy one, but what misperceptions would the public have about how this all works? Are they out there thinking this is entirely a rational process where we're just looking at the numbers and weighing things and then making the decision.
Well, I think one of the things you already touched upon is that sometimes people will see this and they say, oh, okay, the conclusion here is go with your gut, right? And that's not necessarily the main sort of takeaway that we would like. Gut feeling and the investor gut feel is this very complicated sort of emotional, cognitive sort of thing that's happening, and so that's one thing to kind of consider. The other thing is that it tends to suggest that there's this that entrepreneurs can somehow game the system, right? That if you're able to present yourself in a certain way or cater in a certain way, that perhaps investors will then be somehow tricked into investing in you. And so that's something that I'm doing a lot of follow-on research with some co-authors to look at, the influence of, the impact of authenticity versus catering to what you think the investors want, and lots of implications for could this introduce bias, right? If investors are investing based on what their gut feel is, could this maybe be a shroud for them than investing based on their own biases or their own sort of reasons that they can? It's this cover for how they're actually investing. And so these are all things that I'd like to continue looking at because I think they're important to uncover. And
how does your research differ from other research in this area?
I think a lot of the research that has looked at entrepreneurial finance and the way that investors make decisions has been very macro, has been much more economically driven, looking at these hard factors, right? And so this is really looking at those non-codifiable factors, these subtle signals and cues that are actually driving decision making. And so a lot of times we look at these criteria and we're actually able to map them out and very quantifiably look at them. And so what we're trying to do is really take gut feel and this perhaps nebulous concepts and quantify that and look at how are these subtle factors actually driving a very distinct process.
And you've alluded to a couple of areas that you're going to look at next. Do you want to sum up what you're going to do next with this line of thinking?
Yeah, I think I'm really interested in all of these factors that are not necessarily these distinct factors that we typically think about. So like I said, these subtle signals and cues and biases that might be driving important decisions and how that impacts both the decision making as well as the ultimate outcomes.
Thanks for coming in and chatting with us.
Thanks so much.
Okay.
Thanks.